Hey, it's Vivek and Arvind. Let's dive right in. Today, we're with Keerti Shukla, a senior business development manager for Lilac Solutions, where she initially helped develop their patented lithium ion exchange material, which dramatically increases yield in lithium extraction. She holds advanced degrees in material science and engineering from MIT and UC Berkeley. Keerti, welcome to our new pod.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Excited to be here today.
Side note, she's also a good friend of ours, and we've known her for many years. So we're so excited to have you join us and help us get this thing off the ground.
Yeah, I think I
Um,
actually met Arvind when I was like in elementary school, so I've known him for a
That's right. Yeah,
minute.
we definitely weren't having these kind of conversations
Yeah.
back then. Yeah.
um, but to get things started, Kirti, what you're working on, and we've been talking about this in the past, but what you're working on is really fascinating, given that lithium is just such a critical part of our present and our future for battery technology and a big shift in the world towards more sustainable sort of sources of energy. And so maybe we can start a little bit just talking about lithium and why is it so important and what are you seeing on the ground at Lilac?
Yeah, definitely. So yeah, a little bit of context for the uninitiated. There's been a lot of talk about over the past, 10, 15 years about this transition to clean energy. And I think a big part of that requires some way to store this energy, right? Whether you think about grid storage systems or cars or trucks or whatever that might be. So if we just focus in on EVs and battery storage systems, that's a big part of the clean energy transition. And there's a lot of talk about different battery chemistries and how to get the right energy density and things like that. And people are working on sodium ion batteries and all these different chemistries. But I think the industry universally agrees that when we look especially at mobile systems, so EVs, lithium ion just chemically, like the foundations of the chemical principles, has the best energy density. And it's going to outcompete when you think of things like sodium, which is sort of the next best thing. When we go to grid storage systems, where space is not a constraint, you can think about other battery chemistries that might be cheaper. Obviously, you're not space constrained when you're just building a system out in the middle of the farm or in the middle of nowhere. Doesn't really matter. So I think that's where lithium got a lot of excitement. And interestingly, it's actually not obviously the only critical mineral when we look at batteries, right? There's a whole host of things: copper, nickel, cobalt, all these kinds of other minerals. But lithium is obviously one of the big ones. Um, and so, even our founder of Lilac will talk about how, before he founded Lilac, a big part of his focus was looking at battery chemistries, like how can we make better batteries and all of that. But ultimately, everyone sort of agreed lithium is the best. And so then it kind of goes upstream from that, like, okay, where is all that lithium going to come from? And do we have the production capacity to actually meet the needs of the growing EV demand? You look at California, you look at the EU setting all of these ambitious goals for growth and sale of EVs, but there isn't really a plan. The market doesn't really have a way to meet that growing demand with existing mining operations. So that's where Lilac comes into play. It's basically looking at the supply chain and the upstream supply side of lithium and saying, how can we solve that problem? How can we generate lithium faster, cleaner, in a more environmentally friendly way that will meet the growing demand and needs of the future?
And
That's
could
super
you?
cool. And oh, sorry,
Oh,
go
go
ahead,
ahead.
Arv.
Well, I was going to say, could you just say a little more about what the difficulties are with lithium extraction right now? Like, what makes it complicated, and why might people have been interested in other technologies? Like, what's so complicated?
Yeah, definitely. So lithium exists on Earth in two ways. So one is in mineral form, so literally in rock. You may have seen photos of large open pit mines in Western Australia, for example, where they are literally digging rock out of the ground and they send it through a series of processing steps to crush the rock, separate out all the other stuff. And the lithium is actually a very small portion of that rock. And there's different mineral forms, and you can talk to geologists about this for hours and days. But basically, lithium is actually a very small percent. Yeah, these are photos of these large open pit mines. So it's a really, I mean, it's really impressive to see, but also when you think about the impact, it's massive. And so, yeah, lithium's a very small portion of that rock, but it is often the more valuable thing there. So they mine it, they dig it up, and they extract the lithium. The other way that lithium exists, that's more interesting and what Lilac is focused on, is in brine. So under, not seawater per se, but underground water that's actually below the freshwater layer that we find underground, and it is salty water. It's literally like it's got lithium, sodium, potassium, calcium. It's got a bunch of things in it. What I've learned from our resource and subsurface team is that these are usually enhanced underground geological systems that have developed um, a long, long time ago, basically like dinosaur age, if you will, like a long time ago. And it's from the era of, maybe there was a past volcanic eruption hundreds and thousands of years ago. And that has led to this really rich rock that slowly leached out these salts into the water, things like that. So it's enriching that salty water underground. And so that water is actually, in some places, like in South America, you would have seen the salt flats, Bolivia, Argentina, Chile. They basically pump the water out of the ground. They put it on the surface of the earth in a very low depth, and they use the energy from the sun to evaporate off the water and concentrate the salts. So it works. You can definitely extract lithium that way. The yields are not very high because you lose a lot of lithium in that process, and the environmental impact and water loss impact is massive. And so, what Lilac basically does is disrupts that brine extraction method by allowing us to pump the water out of the ground, actively extract the lithium using an ion exchange process. So we pump the water out, selectively just pull the lithium out of solution, send everything else back into the ground. And then we take that lithium downstream for further processing to the battery grade material that would ultimately go into a car battery, for example. So that is basically, the challenges I would say are namely environmental. Obviously, we don't want to keep just pumping water out of the ground and not replenishing it. The yields of these existing methods are very low, and so it doesn't really allow us to scale very well when we think of the growing global demand.
What do you what's considered low?
Yeah, so existing methods are 40-50% yield. So of the starting lithium concentration in the brine underground, they're only getting 40 to 50% of it out as final product. Our technology, for example, would allow us to get over 90%, like high 90s. And so there's no waste. And if you think about it also, right, because we are sending the water back into the ground from the reservoir like that it comes from, any lithium we don't extract isn't actually wasted. It's just, available there in the resource for the next pass through the system. So we aim for in the 90s, basically high lithium recovery anyway. But even that little bit that's lost isn't truly lost. It's just back into the ground for future consumption. Yeah, so environmental cost, and then the rate of ability to scale up. So when you think about building out these large evaporation ponds, the footprint is massive, and scaling that up just takes a really long time. It's just physically a very large land area. And, when you think about wanting to double and triple capacity over the next, by the end of the decade or over the next 10 years, it would really be beneficial to do that in a more efficient manner. So building a chemical operating plant that can pull water out of the ground, send it back in, and have a much smaller footprint compared to the thousands and thousands and thousands of acres of evaporation ponds would allow us to meet the growing demand. And, there's all kinds of different predictions from Goldman, JP Morgan, and Benchmark and Fast Markets and all these industries tracking critical minerals demand and prices. But roughly everyone kind of agrees that, in the last 5 years, demand has tripled, projections for demands, and that's expected to triple yet again in the next, 5 to 10 years. So it's growing pretty rapidly.
Yeah, and one thing I was seeing online is, China seems to dominate the market right now for lithium production. Is that based on, first, is that the method of sort of ground extraction? Do they have more plentiful sort of lithium resource from a ground extraction perspective, and that's helping them to do that? Or is it more government policy that's aligned with their lithium firms being able to pay more, be more land abusive, maybe, or water abusive? Like, what's driving that? And then is Lilac making more of a maybe domestic US play because US lithium resources are more brine based, or is it more like a global play?
Yeah, great question. So on the first one, yeah, China totally dominates when you think about critical minerals and battery manufacturing. But that's actually not because they inherently have a lot of lithium as a natural resource in their country. It's because of their investments and involvements around the world. So they're heavily involved in Australia and in South America, which is basically where the majority of the world's lithium comes from. So they may be themselves like owning a company that operates in those areas and is mining there. They may be investors, 49% investors in these companies. And I think a key thing that China has, and to be fair, China does have also their own lithium extraction domestically as well, but it's not, it's not massive compared to the Australia and Chile, Bolivia, Argentinas of the world. But one thing that China did do is so just a quick chemistry thing. So the lithium gets extracted out of the ground and then basically goes through a series of refining steps and processing to ultimately make it into the cathode, which is one part of the battery. And all these in between steps, like getting it to these different chemicals that then go to the next step and the next step, um, it's costly and requires a lot of processing, and all of these things do better at larger scale. And so what China basically did is dominate the market for refining that material and even making the batteries in a lot of cases, right? So even though they don't have a lot of the lithium themselves, they're kind of a linchpin in the market, like a bottleneck linchpin, if you will, for actually being able to use the lithium. So, South America might have the lithium, but they actually send a lot of it to China for processing and getting it into batteries and maybe even getting it into cars. And so that's ultimately, where it's all going, is to China for the final like polishing, processing, refining. And so that's where they've really dominated, right? Is they've kind of looked at across the entire market, like the mines, the processing and refining of the material, and then also building the batteries in the cars. China has really dominated that as well, and they've come up with electric cars and they have their battery plants, and so that they're able to slice across the entire industry as it comes to lithium, and that also allows them to be cost sensitive to specific fluctuations in certain segments of the market. So when lithium prices drop, it becomes harder for mines to operate because their profit margin goes down, or maybe their operating cost is now higher than even the sale price itself. But for China, they can basically take a loss on that side because they're making it up on the car sales or the battery sales, right? So they can basically they have more wiggle room. And generally, it seems like they're willing to cut off a finger to save the limb, if you will, right? Like they just have that policy of long-term investments. They're not doing anything on a short-term horizon. They can take short-term losses to still dominate a market.
That's so fascinating. I mean, and what's your take on, I mean, is the US trying to catch up? Is it is it actually a race of some sort, or is it just fine that China's sort of in the lead on this?
Yeah, I mean, it's a big thing now. Arvin, to your second question there that I forgot about,
Oh, sorry.
no, it was just, it's kind of related actually. It's, so I would say, it's not too late, but it's a little late compared to what China's been doing for a long time. It's like the Western world, if you will, has kind of woken up. I was at a conference in DC in June, and you have Australia, the U.S., a bunch of European nations represented, and they're all talking about how Western countries need to band together and develop the supply chain that is not dependent on China. Now, I don't think that means that we need to completely cut off China, but I think it's more just a rebalancing, right? For multiple reasons. Obviously, you don't want anything, just from a national security perspective, you don't want it to be too heavily weighted in one country's control, and also from there are speculations that there's a lot of price and market manipulation going on, and so if you have that more distributed around the world, especially for the U.S. like Western ally countries, you could probably you wouldn't see that much of an effect on the market. So I think the U.S. and Europe are, they're definitely waking up to this. They're definitely not okay with what's been going on. I think it's going to be a bit of an uphill battle to bring back production into Europe and into North America, but there's certainly a big push for that. So Europe is moving forward with a lot of not just mining operations, but also trying to get factories built there, so they don't have to send it to China. They can just do it in Europe, and then that works well because a lot of car manufacturers, like in Germany, they have a lot of car manufacturing. So it's sort of like getting a local supply chain all the way through in Europe, like mining to battery production all the way into the cars, and doing that locally. So the EU is doing is really excited about that. Germany is making moves, for example, with all of their manufacturing capability of battery manufacturers and car manufacturers getting into this. The U.S. is obviously making a big push. The IRA under the Biden administration was heavily focused on critical minerals, and we saw a lot of dollars getting invested into companies that are working on domestic production in the U.S. So companies looking to operate in Arkansas and Texas, for example, are getting a lot of dollars from this. And so we'll see what happens with the next administration, but I'm hopeful that because this is sort of like a bipartisan, people across the aisle agree that critical minerals are important, and we need to figure out a way to be self-reliant, or at least a little bit more self-reliant, that's not going to dramatically change with the new administration. And there are domestic resources. So there is there's a geological formation called the Smackover, which is in Texas, Arkansas, extends over into like Louisiana and Texas a little bit as well, but it's most commonly known for Texas and Arkansas. And yeah, Exxon is making a big play into this. So we're seeing really big name companies as well as, smaller companies who've been doing this for a while, really focusing on this domestic production. Exxon actually today just announced an MOU with LG Chemical for supply of lithium to their battery plant that they're trying to build here in the US. And so, it's really exciting. People have mixed feelings about big oil getting into lithium and clean energy. Personally, I think it's good for these companies to raise the profile. They bring the name brand recognition, they bring the money and the capital to be able to execute on these huge, expensive projects. I mean, we're talking about billions and billions of dollars that are going to be required for these projects. So it's not easy for smaller companies to do that. And also a big part of mining and brine, pulling brine up from underground is drilling wells and subsurface. And quite frankly, the oil and gas industry knows that best. They've been doing that for 100 years. They know exactly how to do that. So there's that, and then a little plug for Lilac is there's also the Great Salt Lake in Utah, which is a massive surface level lake, which is nice. It decreases the subsurface risk, and it contains lithium. And so we're developing a project in Utah to extract lithium off of the Great Salt Lake in a non-consumptive manner. So we pull the water out temporarily, extract the lithium, and then put all of the water back into the lake.
Yeah, that kind of I was going to ask you something about regulation in that sense, because, coming from solar in the past, there was some nice driving pressure that you have to get a regulation to make the negative externalities of the other mining methods sort of more expensive, because you're saving land, you're saving water, you're maybe more energy efficient. But if people don't really care, if they're like, well, nobody's charging me for the extra land, or not that much for the extra land, nobody's really charging me for the extra water, energy is relatively cheap to run these things, then there's maybe not enough driving pressure for a better solution to get to market.
Yeah.
So I'm curious, are you seeing a lot of pull from the industry saying we want a more efficient solution, or are you feeling like, hey, we still need to push on a few regulations to make sure that these negative impacts are being priced so that Lilac actually can really thrive and show its might in the industry?
Yeah, that's a great question. My view on this after just kind of, seeing the market over the last few years is people like to talk about green lithium, if you will, the more environmentally friendly lithium, but are not really willing to pay a premium for it. And so, ultimately it's sort of like the capitalistic thing, right? Like people are price sensitive and cost driven, and everyone wants the cheapest thing. But what does give me hope on that front is that governments are taking it into their hands to put out regulations that basically force people's hands. So take an example like Chile. they have passed, rules, and it's not like an immediate effect, but they have passed laws that basically will not allow evaporation ponds after a certain point, and will, if there is an alternative technology that can do it, then companies need to choose that. And so, it's not going to go into effect overnight, and obviously the large mining companies there have a lot of sway, and they're also cost sensitive, but it's like slowly moving in that direction, right? These large incumbent mining companies are evaluating these alternate extraction methods. They're going through the process of looking at how they can switch over their production, maybe within the next 5 or 10 years. Like, it won't be overnight, but they're already, they're working on that, which is, I think, a very promising sign. You take the EU, for example. The EU is great at putting out regulations that basically force people's hands. We've seen that over and over again, and they're doing that here as well, right? They are very strict about how much water can you consume. So fresh water consumption, something I haven't mentioned, is a big part of these operations, and you need fresh water for the process. So separate from the brine that you pull, and decreasing the amount of fresh water that you use is an important part of decreasing your environmental footprint as well. And so the EU is very sensitive to that. And when you put in a permit application for mining, let's say in Germany, and you're talking about a massive amount of freshwater consumption, they may not approve that project. So they're increasing their threshold there, especially if there are alternatives that are proven to have lower water consumption. They're not going to let you choose the worst option. So I think it's a bit of a balancing act, right? I think you don't want the regulations to inhibit go too far and inhibit the development of these projects, and be so punitive that the industry it's so hard to meet them in the near term that it really just disrupts the flow and deployment of these technologies. But at the same time, without those regulations, people won't make that choice, because it will be, or it could be more expensive. And so it's not going to be like, you take an evaporation pond, for example, and you take any other process, like even our lowest cost projects in South America that come so close to evaporation ponds. Like, I don't think that we could ever, or maybe if we have some great, advancements coming, but it's going to be hard to be cheaper than an evaporation pond, because they're literally using the sun as their energy. And so, how do you get cheaper than the sun? Right. And so, it's like we're getting very, very close, and, we're right there in that quartile. But, it's sort of like, I don't know, how can you really get cheaper than the sun? But Chile passing that law allows it to be like, okay, well, yeah, you might have to move up a little bit on the cost curve, but that's too bad. Like, we're not gonna let people keep doing that anymore. And there's just constantly these news articles and studies coming out about the negative environmental impact, and not the land is literally sinking from all the water that they've pumped out of the ground, and they've seen it sink like centimeters and inches over time. So it's like, it's sort of a one-way street. And I think people and governments are trying to make sure that we course correct earlier rather than too late. And that pressure, I think, is good. But, you want it to be a bit of a balancing act.
So one question about domestic production in the U.S. My sense is that the change in administration, like you said, hopefully there's a bipartisan sort of handshake around this stuff, and it's understood. What's your perspective on that, though, with this new administration? They've said they're going to undo a lot of the things that the previous administration came in to do. Like, Trump has been very vocal about that. I'd be curious to hear your take on, what does this bipartisanship really mean?
Yeah, it's really interesting, right? Because on the one hand, Trump is talking about, wanting to repeal and a lot of these things. But on the other hand, he's also very anti-China and is very vocal about that as well. And to me, those are a bit at odds. And so it's kind of like,
Yeah.
what's going to give? So that's one factor, is like, if you truly think about the China angle, right, then this type of investment from the government really does make sense, regardless of what Trump is saying. And then the second angle here is that a lot of the dollars are committed or being spent in red districts. So, you just think about the industrial parts of the nation and where we have the manufacturing and things like that. Those are all in red states and red districts, even within those states. And so, I'm hopeful and optimistic that means that, certain things may get rolled back, and, we might see a change. but it's not going to be a full-fledged like canceling, because it's not in Trump's interest, or in kind of the government's interest, the House, Senate, anything like that, to take away jobs and money from their own people. And I've been reading articles about how representatives in these districts are not just trying to make sure Trump doesn't roll it back by like sending letters and signing things and things like that, but also um, rebranding it in their districts, like talking about it as like an economic revitalization package, job creation package, and things like that, not associating it with like Biden or things like that, and just reframing it as like it's about the economics. And so I think that will really speak to people. I mean, we have the opportunity to create a lot of jobs here and stimulate the American economy and bring manufacturing back here, which I think would be great for the country.
Exactly. Yeah.
And I think when you talk about dollars and cents and sort of the home, like made in America, I think that's something across the aisle people can agree on. And just kind of a tidbit on that, it's like we talk about rolling this back, or like this divide between blue versus red and clean energy and all of that, but like the state that generates the most amount of energy from wind is Texas, for example. Like they call it the wind
Hmm.
corridor and things like that, right? So it's like, at the end of the day, I think, money talks, and where we can implement, or stimulate jobs in the economy and bring things back into America. I don't see how that is not going to be universally agreed upon. Now, I know Trump says a lot of things, and maybe a few things will change, but I'm optimistic that it's not going to be some massive rollback.
Yeah, that's an awesome way to think of it. And Um, maybe switching gears here just a little bit. One of the things that I mentioned at the top of the call when introducing you is that you're now working on more business development, maybe on the business side of the house at Lilac. That's not where you started. You started more on the development side and on the science. So I'd be curious to hear what's been your journey in that, and how did that happen, and maybe talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. Yeah, so when I joined Lilac, I was straight out of a master's program at UC Berkeley in material science and engineering. So I was very much in the weeds on the technical side of things. Joined Lilac in that vein, so I did a lot of materials development, characterization, process optimization. Like, how do we make this material? How do we make it at larger scale? So the first 4 years at Lilac was really spent doing that. It was like day one. I remember a meeting, I think my first or second day at the company, and it was just like, all right, well, we don't know how to do this. We don't know exactly how to make this thing. Like, we got to go and figure it out, and you're in charge of this. And so, back when the company was 10 people, it was all hands on deck. It was, jack of all trades type of thing. Everyone did everything. And so it was really fun to be in the weeds on the technology and really see it, come to life, and figure things out, figure out what works and what doesn't, and then saying, okay, now that things are working, how do we do this at larger scale? How do we support larger projects? How do we support this pilot plant that we want to do that requires more of the ion exchange material to actually extract the lithium, right? And kind of a quick refresher for those who aren't familiar with the technology. It's basically, you pull the brine out of the ground, you run it through a module that contains this ion exchange material. It will pull the lithium out and leave all the other ions in the water, so that water can go back in the ground. And then the lithium can be, um, you know, using a driving force, basically you can desorb it, or like make the material release the lithium. And then that allows you to like get the purified lithium out, and then you can send it to downstream processing. So yeah, it was really fun to work on that applying the fundamental material science, but also like, okay, the scale up, how do we do this at large scale? Really hands on. Like, I was in the lab building control panels, building things. A lot of trips to Home Depot, a lot of material ordered from McMaster, and so it was just very scrappy. It was very scrappy at the early days, which was a lot of fun. Then we got more and more legit and professional, and we started doing things at larger scale, and less ourselves and more working with manufacturers to get the equipment built to spec and all of that. And I think for me, I had always been interested in other parts of the business, right? Like, a technology doesn't make a business. Lots of great ideas out there, lots of good tech that never see the light of day. And it's really, there are so many other things that need to work right for a company to take off. And so, I've always been interested in that. And throughout my time at Lilac, I dabbled in little projects here and there to understand other parts of the business. Like, okay, how does this actually work? Like even permitting and regulatory and working with agencies, because you could get a whole you could be excited about a project and then it just gets squashed because of regulatory issues or protests that, they're seeing this in Europe right now, where Rio Tinto is trying to, set up a mine in Serbia. And there's been massive protests and backlash against it. And they're having trouble pushing it through and starting on it because there's so much, public protesting going on there. And so many different things that need to go right. Like, obviously, yes, at first the technology needs to work, otherwise you have nothing. But after that, there's so much more that needs to work. So that interest of mine, was always there. Dabbled in different projects with, being early at the company meant I had good relationships with the leadership and the C-suite. And so I dabbled in projects here and there. And then finally, had an opportunity where, a VP approached me and was like, hey, do you want to actually like join my team and do this, right? Like work on selling the technology, deploying it globally, working with people who are going to be using our technology to make them believe, getting it out there, so just kind of being more on the other side of the company, but also more like public facing, customer facing, all of that. And, I just kind of took a leap of faith to dive in. And haven't really looked back. I was a little bit nervous that I would miss the technical side a lot. And it would be like, that's all I'd ever known. That's all I'd ever done. But quite frankly, I've just really been excited to apply my technical skills, but in deploying the technology. So I get to work with people all over the world to explain how the technology works, answer their questions, work with their tech teams. So it's really highly technical sales and business development. I don't think, you could just like jump right in from like a SaaS thing and do this type of sales. Like you really need to understand the chemistry and the tech. People have deep questions. And it's been interesting to also see the life cycle of these deals is long. I mean, you're talking about like, we always joke, it's like, it's the equivalent of like getting married. You have to like really like date and figure out like, you and the customer, like, does this really work? Figure out all these things. Like, are we really aligned? Does this work? Like for our brand, for our project, for our jurisdiction, all of these things. And then ultimately a commercial deal comes years into the process of all of these steps, right? And you're working on de-risking the project, proving the technology, testing it, giving regulators what they need to feel comfortable, all of these things. And so it's some days are frustrating. It takes a long time. There was a deal that I was working on where I thought it would close in like August, and it only ended up closing like a few weeks ago. So I think that, these things just take time. And so
that's not even that bad.
That's not that. Yeah. But yeah. And this wasn't like the full blown, commercial deal. It was sort of the beginning, but, yeah. So I mean, for me, I've been really excited. It's like taking my engineering and technical skills and applying it to really making something come to life. And so I'm hitting almost 5 years at Lilac, and I think it's been great to be a part of all these different phases of the company.
Yeah,
That's
it's so
awesome.
so fascinating, and one of the reasons we really wanted to talk to you about it is because we've heard like a little bit about your story, and you talk about this in our our own hangouts, but it's a really inspirational story.
Yeah, I
So
appreciate it.
um,
Do you think you'll go back to the tech side at some point?
That's a good question. I think the door is always open. Yeah, I would say the door is always open. I've often thought about like, if like post Lilac, like what would I do with this knowledge that I've gained? The technical side, the like biz dev side, the sales, but also like in the mining industry. Like I live in the Bay Area, it's not really like a mining hub, if you will. And so
it is a founder
Like
hub, though.
crypto
yeah,
mining,
that's
maybe,
true. Crypto mining, yeah, exactly. And it is a founder hub, that's true. So I've often wondered like, okay, um, yeah, like what will come next? And I'm like, okay, well, I have my engineering and technical background as a fallback, if you will. Like if nothing else, that's always there. But yeah, who knows? Who knows where this whole path will lead? Obviously, the ideal is that Lilac goes big, and that's a great success story. But yeah, It's very uncertain. It's a super competitive market, highly unknown. The mining industry is a tough one to succeed in. And so a lot of uncertainty. But yeah, short answer is the door is always open. I'll never say never. I never thought I'd be in sales. For a long time, it was like I couldn't even say that. I would have to like be like, no, it's biz dev. It's not sales. And, like Rahul, my husband, and like other people would totally make fun of me. And now I'm like, yeah, okay, I'm in sales. I'm doing this. I'm going in. So never say never.
I think, and this is something we can do a whole other podcast on, but or at least I could, is it's kind of my domain is like I've been in sales for many years, but there's sort of like in our community, or even just like in, I guess, elite communities, sales is not always seen as like the word sales, there's just a stigma attached to it.
Totally.
But then when you see what the biggest ballers of our day are doing, it's selling.
Yeah.
Like, what is Jensen Huang doing at NVIDIA? He's selling all day.
Yeah.
He's going on all these different, conferences and podcasts and whatnot, and he's selling. So just one example, but I think it's a skill set that's very underrated, and actually is required for most jobs.
Yeah,
so
I totally agree with that. I think I often talk to our VP of engineering about this, where he's like, look, my job is sales too. Like, yeah, it's leading the engineering team and the technical, but ultimately my job is to sell. And when he meets with customers, like that's the biggest value he can bring in to the company, is selling the tech ultimately, right? Like, you can do all this engineering and development behind the scenes, but if no one wants to buy it, or no one cares, or no one knows how good your tech is, then it's pointless. And so I think that was a big learning for me, is truly appreciating the value of sales. I didn't fully appreciate it before. And I think why this role has been particularly more interesting to me is because it's so technical. Really allows me to like use that part of my brain still. I have to interplay with like the engineering teams, the R&D teams, like all these technical teams, to understand what's going on internally, and then be able to translate that to what is valuable to a customer. And like that has been really fun, because it doesn't mean I'm totally.
And that's what a CEO or founder has to do.
Yeah,
too.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, so it's like I think my experience with salespeople, like when I call up manufacturers and stuff, it's like they don't really know. They're kind of like, I don't know, I have to check. They don't have the answers to the questions. They just give you these like vanilla copy and paste things, and like it was like always really frustrating. And so I viewed it as like, oh, these are people that like don't really know what they're talking about, and like I don't want to be that. And now, I think it's like that's not what it has to be. And actually, if you bring the knowledge base to the sales, you're like that much more powerful. And I think that's a big difference with our team and anyone that we put in front of a customer. It's like they deeply understand the tech at a foundational level, and then they're also good at talking and explaining and all of these things. So when they get a question, they like are immediately able to synthesize it and answer it in a clear way, even these highly technical questions. So that's been really, I think technical sales is really fun.
I got one last one for you, and this is a little bit off what we were just talking about, but we are a 2 electric car family, full electric car. And don't burst my green moral superiority bubble here, but I'm going to ask it, you may end up bursting. Am I actually right now, let's say, Lilac's not a predominant solution. So with the non-green lithium extraction that's going on, like, am I actually driving around something that's worse than a standard combustion engine car right now, given the economies of scale that operates on? Or is it better at the moment? Like what, and where is that transition point if it's not already better?
Yeah. So my personal view on all of this, informed by obviously some reading and things, is the best thing you can do to cars and in general is use things to the end of their life. So I'll say that applies to cars as well. If we take a car coming straight off of the manufacturing line, like a combustion engine car versus an EV, take a typical EV with like it could be a Tesla, it could be something else, but with the like cobalt, lithium, blah, blah, all these other minerals in it. Right out of the gates, I think that the environmental impact of the electric car is actually worse. The mining operations, the footprint, like nickel, cobalt, lithium, these things are really harsh on the environment. You can go and read lots of articles about the cobalt mining in the Congo, the nickel mining in Indonesia. Not only environmental issues there, but also there's a lot of uh, like bad work practices, unsafe work. It's like a whole thing. So that's a whole other podcast. But so I'd say right out of the gates, yeah, I think the impact of the electric car can be worse. But over time, if you drive that car, 8, 10, 12, 20 years, I don't know exactly what the threshold is and probably depends on the two specific cars you're comparing. But over time, the electric car will obviously outweigh, or the impact of the gas car will be worse over time. And so, I don't know. It's like nowadays, especially here in the Bay Area, people, new cars, leasing cars, they don't own them for a very long time. We also don't really know, like, we don't have good long-term data on electric cars and like battery life. We're still figuring all of this out as an industry. And so I think, where you can, using a car for as long as possible or buying a used car, things like that will obviously certainly help. It's about using these for as long as possible. And then the last plug I'll say is there are a lot of companies working on recycling, battery recycling. And so I think that my hope for the industry is that we don't do what we did with oil, but we basically build in the recycling as we're building out this whole industry. And so we call it like virgin mining might need to happen now at a much larger scale to be able to meet, just like we need enough of this mineral in circulation in the world, right? So you have to do a lot of virgin mining first. But ultimately, I would love to see battery recycling become a big part of the market and a big part of the supply. It's hard right now because we don't have enough spent batteries to like do that yet. We need to like have more EVs around for longer to have the supply of spent batteries to make it a big part of the market. Right now, the majority of all battery recycling is done via like scrap off of battery production lines that are just like the disqualified material, like didn't meet quality checks, so send it for scrap and battery recycling. So that's my hope. But yeah, I don't think, Arvind, you should feel bad about driving 2 electric cars, but maybe keep them around for a little longer than you otherwise would.
Love it.
Bubble like partially bursted, but I think that was very insightful.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it'll be cool, right? You go to certain other places in the world where they've like really adopted EVs, like in China, Norway, these, it's like the cities are just like quiet. It's like really like it's really incredible. And so I think that there is a big future there, and it would be great to see this circular economy of like, you'll need a little bit of virgin mining always to kind of meet the market needs, but it's like ultimately in like 50 years, can we just be like recycling this mineral and we don't need to keep pulling it out of the ground?
Yeah, and frankly, it's a much better drive.
Yeah,
So,
I agree. Electric, that's the thing is like people just like you go to like Texas or you go to places and you ask people about electric cars and they're like, no, I need my like this and that. And they like have this like emotional connection. But then if you can get them in the car and drive it, like they pretty much, I think, will universally agree, like it's a better car. It's like, wow, it runs better, it accelerates better. There's no like oil and changing in the engine, all these things. It's like there's fewer moving parts. It's a battery, it's a motor, torque straight to the wheels and go. So yeah, it's a simpler car, it's a better car, but we just have to get there.
Well, this has been such an awesome conversation. I very much met and exceeded my expectations. So thanks so much for taking the time to chat with us.
No, thanks for having me. This was really fun. Not my first podcast soiree, but a very early one, so I'm excited.
Yeah, thanks so much for coming. I mean, from one material science trained person to another, I respect the hell out of what you guys are working on.
Yeah,
I can imagine it's incredibly hard. So it was really fun.
And I can say as one salesperson to another as well.
There you go, man. We're complete. We have the whole Venn diagram
right here. Yeah. Both things are very hard in different ways, but it's fun to have all challenges.
Yeah, keep us in mind if you ever start that company down the line.
There you go.
You guys are probably more likely to start the company before me.
Oh yeah, we'll see.
All right, cool. Should I just leave, or how does this end?